Today I want to show you how we're using form provider components in EmberMap's codebase. And to do that, I'm going to refactor the login flow from the home page here. So on EmberMap's homepage, you can come up here and click this login button, and you can fill out an email address, sam@acme.com, and we email you a link to sign in. Now, if we look at the code, this is the application template here. And down at the bottom, we have this if show sign in. We're going to render this user sign in modal. And if we pop the user sign in modal open, it's this component here. And we see it renders the modal window. And here's the message, enter your email address to sign in. And this is basically how this component is structured. And we can see here that this user sign-in form is another component used within the modal. And this is because there's a few different places in EmberMap where you can put your email address in and get a sign-in link. So over time, we abstracted that logic into user sign-in form. And here we can see we have user sign-in modal, and then right here is the form. And the form contains all the logic needed to set up a user, and we see that we also pass in the sign-up source, where they're signing up from, and any other data we want to know about how the user is logging in. We create a user, and then down here we have this sign-in action. And so this is where the meat of the logic is, this user creation and then the sign-in. And if we look at the template, we can see that down here is where we actually render the form. And we have label and input for email, and we have this UI button. So this user sign-in form was created, again, because there's multiple ways to sign in. But if we look at some of the APIs here, we can see, this component has a button text parameter, which defaults to email me a link to sign in. And if we come over here and click that, we can see that that is the button text for this home page. But I think we also use this over on the subscribe page. So if you click a plan, this is another place where we can send you that sign-in link. And here we see the button says create account. So that's an example of where this is being customized, and same with the button submitting text. And if we come to the template, we can see that those are being used right here. Now, we also, if we will come up here, we'll see that right here we yield something called lead paragraph, and right here we yield something called after sign-in. And if we come back to the modal to see how this form is being used, here's where we're rendering it, passing in the sign-up source, and then we use this API. We yield out this section variable, and if the section equals lead paragraph, then we can render this. Otherwise, if the section is after sign-in, then we render this OK button. And this is just kind of an API that we came up with to help us customize how this form is rendered in different situations. And if we pull up the subscribe plan template, we can see down here on line 29, we're also rendering that form, and we're customizing the buttons text, and we're also customizing the copy that we render in these two sections. So this is a decent way to reuse some of the logic in sign-in form in both of these places. But if I open these next to each other, you'll probably just see, just by looking at this, that this is not headed in the best direction. We're trying to share functionality from the sign-in form, but as these new use cases show up, we need to add parameters like button text and button submitting text. We have these two sections which are doing what we need them to do right now. But if we look back at the actual sign-in form, we're yielding this area and this area, but what if some other caller wanted to customize this part of the template or something that we didn't yield, right? And this is the problem with APIs like this, is that they can be restrictive and they don't give the callers enough flexibility to customize it as much as they need to. This is pretty good for reuse, but if there's a new situation where we need to add another way to sign in and we haven't thought of all of the texts and areas that we need to customize, we're going to run into issue and we're going to need to open that sign-in form to customize it. Now, ideally, there would be a way that we could share all of the business logic of the form. So if we come back and we open up the user sign-in form here, there's a lot of business logic in here. It's dealing with these create records, and the sign-in action is using the metrics service, and it's calling save. There's a lot of logic that's not related to the presentation that's in this form that ideally would be able to share. And that's exactly what the provider component does. So the provider component that we made implements all of the logic related to signing in a user, but the template is just yielding out the parts that a caller would need to make their own form. So now a caller can use the provider, but render their own form and wire things up themselves. And that way we don't get into the situation where the different callers are having to customize a single form in this way. So we actually already have the provider written here. This is the component. It's not too long. And again, here's a template. We yield a user because if someone's rendering a sign-in form, they would want to be able to use a user to render maybe the user's name and then also bind an input to the email. And then we also yield this tasks hash, which yields an Ember concurrency task, which the calling form can kick off in order to submit the form. So these are all the pieces that we need to build our form. And what we're going to do now is come and refactor our homepage sign-in to use the provider. So let's pop open that sign-in modal again. And down here on line 18, this is where we render the sign-in form. Now over here, I actually have my acceptance tests running, and I have it filtered down to the suite for sign-in, and we can see that all those are passing. And if I come over here and comment out the sign-in form, hopefully these tests would fail. And there we can see the tests are failing. So if we refactor it correctly, these should be passing again. And now when we click login, we don't see any message here. So the first step is going to be to render our user sign-in form provider. And this yields a provider, we'll just call it P. And what I'm going to do here is over here open up the user sign-in forms template. And this is all the presentation that we want to extract from the user sign-in form. So let me just try to grab this, paste it in here. And let's take a look at this. So we're rendering a provider. We got a div. We say if did submit is true, we want to render this part, which says we sent a link to your email to sign in, please check. So let's not worry about that now. That's after we submitted it. So let's just comment that out and comment this out. And let's just take the first case for the form. We also have this error state. Let's just ignore that for now so we can get this right. And let's take a look at this. So we just render some markup here, and in our component we were yielding the lead paragraph, but now we're just going to render what we were rendering in there. Here was the lead paragraph, and it was some text like this. So we'll just copy that and paste it right here. And then we render our form, and we call this sign-in action. And remember, in our component, this was calling sign-in from the local component here. But now we're getting this sign-in action from our provider. And our provider is up here, and it's yielding out P. And remember, P has a p.tasks property, which has the sign-in action. And so we can actually just keep this action here, and we can use the perform helper to go ahead and perform that task. Next, we render a label for the email address. And then we render this input, which is bound to user.email. And again, in our component had a local user property. In this case, we want to bind to p.user.email because the provider is giving us a user that we get to log in. Everything else looks good there. Then we have this button, which is our submit button. Now it was disabled if isSubmitting was true. So let's come over here, open up the component and just see what isSubmitting is. So isSubmitting looks like some state that we were managing while we were signing in, and we set it true and then we set it false once everything was done. But in our case, we have this task. And the cool thing about tasks, p.task.signin, is that they have derived value. So now we can actually use p.task.signin.isRunning to just disable or enable our button. And we can do the same thing here for the value. Now, if it's running, we want to render out the right text. And if we look at our caller here, we didn't customize that text. That was the other caller that customized it. So if we come back and look at the defaults, here's the default button text. Get this in quotes. And if it's submitting, we'll render sending. So let's just save this and see how this works. Okay, so we see our form. Looks like the submit action is wired up. And if I type in sam@acme.com, okay, it seems like something's happening. We saw the button say sending, so the action was triggered. And if I look in my console, it does seem like we had a post request go out, which is what happens when we click this button. That's the provider's action running. So it does seem like some things are wired up here. Now, if we check our first failing test, the test says, I see a welcome message when signing up for the first time. And we expected to see some text that says, we sent a link to bob@micro.com to create an account. So I think what's happening there is that this might be working, but we're not rendering the success state of this form. So let's come back and get that working. Now, if we come up to that other state, we had this liquid if did submit. So let's go ahead and uncomment that, and we'll uncomment this. And here we can see the success message is being rendered. So this is saying if did submit is true, we want to render this block. So let's come over and look at the template here. Did submit is used up at the top in the template from our original form. And over here it starts off as false. And we can see that our original sign-in action here was setting it to true. So it was just doing some more state management here to display this logic. Now there's a couple ways we could recreate this behavior in our new template. And one way would be to use the provider's user, p.user, and Ember data models have an isNew property. So presumably if our submit action works and the user becomes saved, they won't be isNew. So if not isNew, that means the user is saved, and then we'll render this block. And again, we can get rid of this after sign-in yield, and this user becomes p.user. So this is one idea. Let's just save this and see if it works. sam@acme.com. All right, that's pretty cool. Seems to have worked. And the test is passing. So this is kind of an idea where we use derived state from the user in order to render this alternative message. And there's definitely something nice about that. Now, part of me wonders if this is putting a bit too much knowledge inside of this template here about what it means for this form to have been submitted successfully, right? We're basically assuming that If the provider's user is not new, then it's done everything it's need to do, and we can go ahead and hide the form now. But that's a bit of a jump, and it happens to be true right now. But what if this provider's submit action changed later? And what if after the user was successfully saved, it needed to do some more work? So the problem with this is that we're assuming the user being saved means it's done with everything, and that might not be the case in the future. So another way that we have been attacking this problem is to use our new UI form component. And we've used that in a few places in the code base, but here we're obviously still using kind of just the bare bones form. But let's go ahead and refactor it to use this new UI form component that we have. Now I'll go ahead and get rid of this ID. I think this was just left over. And UI form basically maps to form, but it just has some goodies. So instead of having to wire up the submit action, UI form actually just takes a submit task. So we can actually just grab this sign-in task here, pass it on into UI form, and it's going to wire up all that for us. So we'll go ahead and replace this with the closing UI form. And let's save this. And our tests are still passing. Now something else UI form gives us is an after success callback. And because the form knows about our submission task, it can tell us when everything is done. So even if this sign-in task changes over time, from this caller's perspective, all we care about is when that thing is done. And when it is, we can just pass in a new action, and we can just mute a new variable here that says did email. And we can just set that to true. And this is going to say, after we're done submitting, go ahead and set a new local variable to true. And that way we know the form has done its task. So what we can do is grab this, come up here, and now we can just say, if we did email the user, go ahead and render this template. And I see I forgot this to be p.user here. And the really cool thing here is that we're still able to use the user from the provider, because the provider's up here, it's not going anywhere, even though we're breaking down the form completely down here. So let's give this a shot. Test seems to work. And if we come try this out, sam@acme.com, and there we go. So this is a really good solution because now this template has no knowledge of what it means to have successfully submitted the form. It just uses this nice after success callback. Okay, let's check out this test suite. So we have one more failure. And this is for the test that says, I see an error message if the server fails. We should see sorry. And we can assume that this has to do with this block right here, which we still have commented out. So let's uncomment this. And we can see here from the original form, we were using this local did error property. And we can just see that is another piece of state that we were tracking manually in our sign-in action. But again, because we have this sign-in task yielded to us from the provider, we should just be able to check if the sign-in task last errored. So this is some more derived state from Ember concurrency. And if this is true, we should render this. And note, we don't have to worry about this firing because this only fires if the form is successful. So we won't switch off of this state if there's a problem. So let's go ahead and save this. All right, we see the test is passing now. And if we come here and try it out, so if we try to sign in without putting anything in, we see this error message. Now that's kind of ugly and it doesn't really stand out. So I think we have a new UI alert component at this point. And I think we can use style error. All right, and now we have that error message showing up again. And if we come back here, all of our tests are passing. So let's come back here and we'll close this. Let's take a look here. So we're rendering the provider. We render some content there. Here's the form. And this is a little wordy to me. I think we used to use style inputs for our buttons when they were in forms, but now we just do type submit. So let's just fix this really quick. And I'm going to move this from a parameter to a block. So this will be UI button. And now we can just use if sign in is running, then we'll render sending, else email me a link to sign in. And I think this is just a better way to use components these days. So the button still looks good and things still seem to be working. Okay, so let's take a look at what we ended up with. We're here in a modal. We rendered this provider. And first we render some copy here. We render a form that takes in the provider's task. And if it's successful, we mutate this. But we render this whole form using data from the provider. And we also render some different states of our buttons and other parts of the template using state from the task that the provider gave us down here as well. And I just want to come up here and compare this to what we started out with. So let's go ahead and open that subscribe plan template, which is another place we're using the sign-in form. Now, I think the biggest win to the provider pattern here is that if you're an Ember developer working on this application and you open this template, you're seeing a bunch of components that you probably work with every day. We have UI modal here, we see SVG jar, we see some presenter components here, and now we see this sign-in form provider with some liquid if. There's a lot of composition going on here. And when we get down to the actual form, then we're rendering this UI form component, which again, if you are working in this app and you've rendered forms before, chances are you've used UI form. So now you're passing in the task from the provider, and down here we're just rendering inputs and labels. So think if you had to make a change to this homepage form and it was just at the presentation layer. Well, you would just be able to change it right here. So now say that you had to make a change to how the sign-in form works as part of subscribing to a plan on the site, like we saw at the beginning. So now you come and find this template and you see that the user sign-in form is here and there's some customization right here. Really, what's probably going to happen is you're probably going to have to open up this user sign-in form to make the changes that you need, unless these APIs happen to match exactly the changes that you need to do. So the real benefit here is how well this pattern decomposes and how it lets you use the components you're already familiar with to build up the forms that you need, or other things you might be able to use providers for. Not only forms, but forms is a really good use case. Over here, if you're coming here 3 or 6 months later, you might have not written this, or someone else might have written it, or you might just not remember it. And chances are, once we open user sign-in form, not only are we going to see the presentation layer here, but we also have this component, right? And this component has a mixture of presentation logic, but it also has all of this business logic around signing in a user. And so now you're having to look and understand all of this. I mean, there's state down here is submitting and did error, that we saw that we were using for presentation logic, but it's mixed with all the business logic. And so the main point here is that this component right here, user sign-in form, is really just a structural component. It's not being used to separate concerns. The only reason we have this component is just to keep all of the stuff related to sign-in and this particular form in a new file. It just moved everything that would have been in this file and in this component into its own space. But we're not actually using this to share that much. I mean, there's a little bit that we can share, but it's not a clean separation. The nice part about the boundary with the form provider is that it's very clear. The provider has all the business logic and no rendering logic at all. Now that does mean that the caller has more responsibility here, right? The person who is writing this form is now responsible to render everything needed to make this form. But this gives them more control. And as common patterns in the form layer emerge from different uses throughout the app, those can be abstracted further into components of their own, but they don't need to be mixed with the business logic, assigning in a user or subscribing to a plan or adding a team member. Those things can be separate, and now you can focus on how best can we abstract just the presentation layer of the form as a completely separate problem from how can we expose the business logic needed to perform a certain task. So this is why we love form providers so much, and we're definitely going to keep using them in the future, and I would suggest you take a look at using them in your own apps as well.